Hey everybody, sflogicninja here. You can call me David Earl. I don't care. So, a couple years back, I went to a Skrillex show. I got in by accident. Got into the VIP section actually, which is pretty amazing. And Skrillex was walking around back there. It was amazing. So I went up to him and I said, "Hey, thanks for signing a band that was made up of students of mine. They're called the M Machine, and they're totally awesome, really wonderful guys. And I'm just so happy that you were able to support them." And he looks at me and he says, "You look really familiar." I said, "Dude, you don't know me. I've done some stuff, but we don't really run in the same circles, but I think you're really awesome, and it's just great to meet you. And again, I wanted to thank you for making the M Machine happen." Later on, there was this girl there, and she grabs me by the arm and says, "You're the YouTube guy." And I said, yeah, I did sflogicninja, do that stuff. And she's like, "Sonny!" And she goes and she grabs Skrillex and like drags him over and says, it's the YouTube guy. It's sflogicninja." And he looks at me and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's where I know you from. Yeah, I've watched all your videos, man." And my head spun around, and it was a really crazy experience to think about. The videos that I've made over the years having that kind of an influence, and it just stunned me. And that was a while ago. That was like a couple years ago, and I was honestly, I've been doing a lot of stuff with Macro Video, and I did some classes with Pyramide Online and all that kind of jazz. But I hadn't been posting videos very much, well, at all, actually. And I just recently, I decided that it's time to get back into it. That was an amazing thing to hear, that I had that kind of influence on somebody's career who's like, a superstar. And it made me feel really good about what I do on YouTube, or what I did on YouTube. It was quite a while ago. And there's a lot of YouTube channels that do what I do. I mean, there's a lot of these like tip and trick videos. There's some amazing stuff out there, and they have way more people than I do. And I got busy working and all that kind of stuff, so wasn't sure where I fit in that world. But now I've got some ideas. Yeah, I just have some ideas, and I kind of want to get back into it and show you guys workflow stuff, interview some people maybe, do some stuff that's a little, that's pretty interesting, and I think would be a lot of fun, and I think worth your time. So, kind of an awkward video, and I said like 4 times now. I'll probably have to edit those out. Maybe I won't. There's a lot of stuff that I've been up to. I'm not going to sit here and give you the litany, because we're already at like 3.5 minutes, and I've just been sitting here blabbing. But I just wanted to say I really appreciate you, and thank you so much for the opportunity of, being able to do this on YouTube, and I hope to be able to entertain you more. That said, you have a lot of questions for me. The question about what I've been up to, I will answer that in a different video. But for now, I want to answer all the logic-related questions, or as many as I can, from the comment section of the teaser video that I just put out. And we'll just get right back into it, It's like riding a bike, right?
All right, let's get started. First thing is, excited for your return. Thanks. I'd love to know best tips, practices, setups for integrating machine complete control, blah, blah, blah. Yes. Okay, so check it out. I am actually making a big long-form video for Ask Audio on this thing. But let me show you some stuff. If I go over here and grab myself Machine 2, it's going to load up, and you can either have Machine in stereo or multi-out mode, depending on how you want to route the outputs of Machine. That's the audio outputs. You might decide to do a multi-output. Then once you have that together, of course, the way that Machine works is that you've got these groups that contain sounds and patterns, okay? So each group can have up to 16 different sounds, and then you can have 16 different patterns within that group as well. So if I go into my browser here, and I'll choose a group and load up a kit. So here's the kit. Sounds are down below. Up top, we have this thing called an idea pad. I'm going to get rid of that and look at my linear view. Okay, this is like an arrange view. In Logic, this is going to run alongside Logic, but in order to make it work, you have to have a scene. So I'll pop a scene in there. Now, a scene is an organization of groups and sounds, okay? So there we go. And one thing you want to make sure of is turn this loop off. That way, Machine will be running linearly, just like Logic is. Otherwise, it'll just keep looping the scene over and over again, which maybe you want to do that. Maybe you want to have, you know, it's like the main loop of your song, and that's it. But if you want to be a bit more linear with it, then you can choose a pattern to go here. And as you see up top, I've got these buttons mean I have a Machine Studio and I have a jam, okay? Now, the best thing about a jam is that it's really easy to pick your patterns here and get them in. This particular group didn't load with any patterns. Let me see if I've got... Yeah, there's one that actually has a pattern loaded into it. So when you've got a pattern here, so that's one group with pattern. I may load in another group and then browse for a different kit. So there's a pattern in group 1. Here's a pattern in group 2. And that will play for 8 bars and then stop. Basically, there'll be nothing afterwards. As you see, as I move my playhead in Logic, it moves as well within Machine. So that's sort of the simplest way to do it in terms of running them side by side. If you want to have multiple outputs, then you would just open the mixer, hit this plus button a bunch of times, and then within Machine, one of the most important things to kind of get your head around is the groups versus master kind of thing. So here I've got my mixer mode. I'm going to turn that off so I can see this view. Up top we have a range. In the middle we have our kind of controller area, and then down below we have our arrangement. Okay, so like if I click on a pattern, I'm seeing the pattern down below. If I click on a group, I see the group down below. There's the pattern that's assigned to the group, and we can see it represented here. Okay, now master means everything that's coming out of Machine. Group, that's going to be the audio output, MIDI input, all the settings for that group. So for this specific group, if I go to output and choose audio, I can choose external 1, which would go to one of those auxiliaries that I created, right? So that's how to route the audio. Now, as far as getting MIDI into Machine, if you want to use Machine as a glorified sound module, you click input, and under channel, you assign a channel, and it will receive that channel from your DAW. Like in this case, we're using Logic. So it will receive MIDI active on channel 1. And as you see here, we've got channel 1 set up already. So that came from my keyboard. I actually just played my controller keyboard and was able to play the sounds, basically starting at on C1. I'm able to play the sounds within Machine, and I could actually do sequencing with Logic like I would do normally. If you want to use the Machine pads, you actually have to turn Machine Studio, the hardware, into MIDI mode by holding Shift and hitting channel on the upper left-hand side of the thing. All right. So basically, I've got MIDI going to Machine, and I got audio coming out of Machine, and I can do it for the group. Like I can have a MIDI channel assigned to the group, and every sound gets its own key. Or I could go to each individual sound, and I could give each individual sound, if I go host 1, then I actually get a, I can play that kick like a chromatic instrument, which is pretty cool from my keyboard. So that's the really simple 6-minute answer. That's how you can get MIDI into Machine. If you want to get your patterns out of Machine, it's actually really easy. You just grab the MIDI here and you just drag it into Logic. Don't want to import tempo, thank you. And when you want to get to different channels within Machine, okay, there's the pattern that I currently have in there and I can assign it. And so how do we get the different channels though? I want to show you that real quick too. Go to Machine, Track, Other, Next MIDI channel. Boom. So you're playing the same instrument, but you're getting the next MIDI channel that plays in a Machine. So there you go. That's the sort of 6-minute answer to that whole thing. But those are the basic concepts that you need, and you can probably get started with that. Let's get to the next question. Hello, I would like to know more about Logic's MIDI effects, especially the option to control instrument parameters with the sequencer, or perhaps some hidden gems. I'm assuming by sequencer you mean arpeggiator, because the sequencer isn't a MIDI effect, but we'll get into that later. And of course, how are you? It's been a while. I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. I'll have a follow-up video that tells you all the kind of stuff I've been doing. Let's get into MIDI effects. So here we are. I'm gonna grab myself something simple, like a, oh geez. Yeah, I'll use an electric piano. What the heck? We'll start with working with an instrument. So the MIDI effects, there's all kinds of cool MIDI effects. Arpeggiator, arpeggiates notes. Chord trigger, one note on your keyboard triggers a chord. Modifier will actually, oop, that's a modulator. Sorry. I'm just gonna pull this up so you can see it. So modifier actually takes a MIDI event, and translates it into a different MIDI event. But also what it can do is it can assign to a plugin parameter, which is pretty cool. If we go to modulator, you'll see that this too, if we see a 2 area, it means that we can learn a plugin parameter. So in this case, well, let me just get through the rest of the effects real quick. So that's modulator. We got a note repeater. It's pretty self-explanatory. Randomizer is pretty cool. You can randomize any MIDI event that comes in. Then we have a scripter. This is where you can actually use script to make your own plugin, which is pretty insane. Transposer, and a velocity processor. So check it out. Let's go to the arpeggiator. Now the arpeggiator doesn't actually have an area where you can assign the output to a plugin parameter. However, if we went to a modifier and I said the input event is going to be note number and I'm going to reassign it to a plugin parameter, then technically we could assign. So right now, if you can see, the intensity knob over here is moving as the arpeggiator is going, which is pretty cool. To make things a bit more radical, maybe I'll pop an EQ on here with a low cut, and I'm going to reassign to learn plugin parameter frequency of the low cut. Nah, that's a bit too intense, right? So maybe I'll pull this back. Turn my Q up a little bit. That's a pretty cool sound. So yeah, that's what you would need to do if you wanted to use the arpeggiator, which is kind of what I'm assuming you were saying by saying sequencer. But we're taking the notes from the arpeggiator, converting them from a note number to a plugin parameter value, and then assigning it. But learning the parameter values is actually very easy. Now let's say that I got something like a modulator behind it, and the modulator gives you an LFO. So I'll assign it to a plugin parameter, and let's say I choose this mid frequency, which is going absolutely nuts. As you see, it's like going kind of crazy. So the first thing I'll do is I'll turn this rate way down and pull this up a little bit. Give it a little bit of Q. So what you want to do when it's just a little bit too much is just turn the output level down. That way it won't be quite as extreme. Of course, what's happening now is that the other the other parameter that I assigned is sort of overshadowing our lovely peak, which you can see still traveling along here. Maybe if I turn this off. So that's pretty fun. Now, you only get one assignment per plugin, but what's kind of neat is that you can pop in another plugin. So if I go underneath this MIDI effect and just create another modulator, I can choose another one. And I'll turn its output level down. Offset it a little bit. So that's pretty fun. Anyway, that's how you do the assignments. Have fun with them. These are all really amazing. The MIDI plugins are a lot of fun. Great that you are back. It has been a long time. Are you still with Pyramid? I am teaching a couple of online classes with Pyramid, but I don't teach at the ground campus anymore. Mixing tutorials. I would be interested in mono or stereo reverbs in the mix. Which is better? Compressors, VCA, FET, opto. So basically the circuit types of compressors and mono and stereo reverbs. Now notice I said and, because I wouldn't say mono or stereo reverb. I would say mono and stereo reverb. So let's talk about reverb for a second. So if I pop a Platinum Verb stereo on here, essentially what I'm getting is a delay-based reverb that gives me early reflection. So that's the immediate from, like if I clap, it goes from my hands to the wall and directly back to me. That's an early reflection. Then I have reverb, which is the more diffuse sound. After the early reflections, the sound gets kind of diffuse and you get more of a sound instead of a direct reflection. If I'm emulating something like an older reverb, like a spring reverb, a plate reverb, something like that, I would use a mono setting. So either really make the stereo bass small and the spread small on one of these plugins, or just take that auxiliary, make it mono, and then do all your settings here. So if I was doing something like a plate reverb or a spring reverb, I'd probably bring the diffusion way down, and do some things to make it sound like a more old-timey reverb. Now, this plugin is a delay-based plugin that's using a sequence of delays to create the reverb sound. If we use something like Space Designer is different from the other three reverbs, N-Verb and Silver Verb and Platinum Verb, in that it's an impulse response reverb. So what's happening here is that we have a real-life sound, a real-life space that's been recorded, and we're able to convolve the sound that we have, this drum kit, into that real space. So you can go out and you can record like a church or something like that, pop it in here, and you get the reverb of that church in the plugin available to you. When we get into these sounds, they actually do have plate reverbs and spring reverbs and that sort of thing. Now, this is actually in stereo, but again, you can just come in here and make this a mono auxiliary and then use that. Now, mono or, I would never say or, mono or stereo, because what I think about when I'm using a stereo reverb is that's usually the glue reverb, or that's everybody needs to be playing in a room together, or maybe you have a room mic from a drum kit and you want it to just sound a little bit bigger, or you want to give it like an artificial room, and you want to excite that artificial room. Then I will use a stereo reverb. Mono reverbs are usually, if you pan them left and right, you can create different sort of reverb lobes. You can have one that's on the left and one that's on the right and maybe one in the center. But with reverb, I always like to say reverb's like ketchup. If you put too much reverb on, everything ends up sounding like reverb. Just like if you have a overdone steak and you put ketchup on it, you're an idiot. No, I'm sorry, I'm digressing. My mind went somewhere else for a second. Yeah. So if you're using a stereo reverb, you got to realize that's taking up, it's going to be not as correlated. It's going to be in both speakers, and it's going to be slightly different in both speakers. And if you want to have a very directed reverb, something that you can sort of collapse a bit, you'd use a mono reverb, because mono reverbs are pannable. You can pan them in the stereo field, whereas stereo reverb, you can collapse the stereo a little bit if you go in and pop a, like if I went in here and got myself another reverb, let's say a platinum verb, and I wanted to, well, like I said, you can collapse your stereo bass inside the plugin, which is cool. But if you're using a third-party plugin or something like that, you could come into the imaging and go to your direction mixer, and this also allows you to change the spread. But I would say that mono reverbs are good if you're going for either an old-time spring plate, something like that, and want to create different reverbs in different parts of your mix in the stereo field. That's cool. And stereo reverbs are going to be more of this homogeneous space that everything has access to. Now, let's get into circuit types. To talk a little bit about circuit types, I need to hire a drummer. So I'm going to go to drummer, and I'll choose alternative and hit create, and then choose my guy. I really like Gavin. Gavin's my bro. Wait. Yeah, there he is. Skinny tie. Check that out real quick. Gavin, bro, you're kind of slow. Cool. Now let's talk about the compressor. So in the compressor, we've got all these different circuit types. The first one is the one that originally was created for Logic, called Platinum Digital. Then we have VCA and FET. At the very end, we have Opto. So let me give you a really quick breakdown. Platinum Digital is an all-digital software compressor. That's all it is. When we go to Studio VCA, VCA is a voltage-controlled amplifier. So voltage-controlled amplifier compressors in real life are incredibly fast and tend to be pretty transparent if they're well made. The subtle hint with this brushed aluminum is that this is supposed to sound like a Focusrite. It's supposed to sound very transparent and clean. So if I turn my ratio up to something like, I'll choose 4:1, something pretty heavy, and start messing with it. And that's a little too loud on the output. I'm going to pull my makeup gain back to 0. Even with a fairly high amount of compression, it's still doing pretty good. Now, Studio FET. Studio FET, this is more like a URI 1176, and the field effect transistor is the type of transistor that's making this compressor possible. It's also very, very fast. A lot of people will talk about the attack and release settings on this to be fast and faster. It's just very good for drums and things like that. It tends to be a pretty aggressive compressor. Now you can hear just how different that is from the Studio VCA. Much more extreme. When we get into classic VCA, you notice how some of the controls keep disappearing? So with Studio VCA and Studio FET, we're given pretty similar stuff. But then when we get to classic VCA, threshold ratio makeup, that's it. This is modeled after something more like a DBX 160, which has a very, very fast attack front end, not subtle at all, and it has a lot of bite to it. So with all of this transient material, we can hear that the VCA, it kind of clamps down on it a little bit more. Vintage VCA, this is sort of similar to the VCA compressors that were on, say, an SSL mixing desk, where you'd bus a bunch of stuff through and have a bunch of elements being compressed at once, used as a glue compressor. So it's made to be transparent like the studio VCA. Let me get my knee up. And as you hear, it's a little more aggressive. And just has a different sound to it. But also very fast compressor, and I usually don't compress more than like 5 dB with this one. Vintage FET, well, it's basically this, but slightly different. Now, it's probably going to be really hard to check this out over YouTube and really get an example, like a good idea of what's going on. So I highly recommend going in and over-compressing stuff. So I tend to think of the vintage FET to be a little bit sloppier, a little bit more open with its transients and its response. And then we have Opto, and what this is it's a compressor. It was the first kind of compressor ever built, actually, that used a photo-optic receptor, like literally a light bulb and a photo-optic receptor to do the compression. So as the audio energy came through, the light would get brighter and dimmer, and then you had a photo-optic or a photocell receptor, whatever it's called. It's a receptor that basically could detect that light and then adjust the amplifier accordingly. These tend to be slower, a little bit more transparent, better for, not for transient material so much, but better for sort of longer stuff like basses and vocals and all that sort of thing. And they also introduce a little bit of what some people consider pleasant distortion. So as you'll see, one thing you'll notice with the Opto setting is that it lets a lot more of the bass frequencies through. A lot of the lower frequencies come through because it's a little slower. All of these are based on response curves. Basically, they're trying to make the compressor in Logic emulate these other compressors in how these compressors respond to transients, the way that they respond to audio. So I highly recommend playing around with those different circuit types. I think you'll have a lot of fun with them. Synthesis theory, maybe? Never got into sculpture because it was too deep. Maybe tips and tricks, applications, and ideas with sculpture. All right, check it out. Sculpture, I could do a whole half hour on sculpture. But what I want to do is give you concepts behind sculpture that might help you program it. If I go into the instrument here and choose sculpture, from the default settings, I'm going to go to tutorial and choose default. Let's talk a little bit about sculpture and what it is. Sculpture is called a physical modeling synth, and it's based off of one of the first physical modeling archetypes, which is the Car+Strong method. And what that is basically a little piece of noise that goes through a delay, gets filtered, and then it feeds back on itself. And it ends up sounding like a string. It's a very sort of rudimentary example of how a string works. You can do a lot with that, though. And what they've done in Logic is they've basically created this, this super massive instrument that's all based off of that one, you might call it a string theory, called the Car+Strong method. Go look it up. When you're looking at sculpture, don't think of it in the same way that you think of a synth. It is laid out fairly similarly. We do have the thing that makes the sound on the left, we have a filtering thing in the center, and then at the end we have our effects and amplitude parameters and all that sort of thing. But when we come over here, you notice how it doesn't say oscillator, it says object. So object 1, object 2, object 3. In this little window here, if you control click, you can enable string animation. So here's what's going on. This is a string. This green line is a string. These numbers that you see, 1, 2, and 3, are the objects that are going to excite that string. So with object 1 right now, we have impulse. So an impulse is just a little impulse against the string. We can strike the string, which would be like taking a mallet or something and hitting the string. We have pick, bow, bow wide. These are all different ways that we know how to excite a string. And you can see that the string animation here is emulating how that string would vibrate if we excited the string at that point with this object. When we turn the intensity up, you can see that little orange area gets brighter. When I move it, you can hear the timbre of the sound change. Now we also have these pickups. Just like on a guitar, we have pickup A and pickup B. So that's also going to affect the timbre of our sound. Where those pickups are located, just like when you have a guitar and you move your pickups around. When we go to object 2, we get a couple of other things we can do. We can disturb it. We can bounce on it. We have mass and binding and damping. And then we also have external, which means that we can feed another sound into this synth and excite that string. So I'll choose bouncing. Turn the intensity back a little bit. Now there's all kinds of little parameters that you can mess with on each of these objects, but that's the basics. When you get to the right here, you have the type of material that the string is based on, whether it's nylon, steel, wood, or glass, okay? We have media loss. So media loss is essentially going to be whether you're playing in air or playing in mud. Like, you'll end up with less vibration in the sound and more damping happening on it because of the medium that the string is being excited within. And we have the resolution of the sound. We have tension mod. Tension mod is where things can get really more randomized, just like a real string would, when you apply different tensions to that string. We also have the wave shaper up top, and we have a filter down below. Then over here it gets a little bit more, you know, we have a delay built in, that's fine. And then we have body EQ, which is kind of interesting. The body EQ, these are actual EQs that have been modeled after real instruments. So if we do something like a kalimba, we're going to get a very kalimba-ish kind of tone out of the instrument. And that's pretty cool. You can shift different parameters of that model if you like. Then down below, we have our modulation. So things get really insane here. I can't go too far into this or we'll be here all day. But you can assign your LFO. And what's interesting is when you're assigning something like an LFO, usually we think of LFOs being assigned to filters or amplitude or that sort of thing. If I turn on LFO 1, not only do we get pitch, but we get string stiffness, inner loss, media loss, position, strength, timbre, all this stuff, which is really fun to experiment with when you are working on a physical modeled synth. We also have these envelopes. We have 2 envelopes that we can assign to do what we like. And then the big one is the morph pad. So there's actually 5 different settings of parameters that you get here. There's the center, there's A, where we can shift stuff around. There's B, shift stuff around. Do-do-do-do-do, do-do-do. And you can just, you know, make changes to these parameters. And as you move this little ball around, you see it's actually shifting those parameters, right? And you can actually record that movement. So if I turn on note and move, basically I hit a note on my keyboard. Let go of the note, turn off record, and that movement is going to be recorded into this pad. So I need to actually set it here so I get all of the different areas. And then choose envelope, Choose. Oh, why didn't that work? Do I have to actually be in play? Let me try that again. Oh. There it is. So I turn the pad on, and then I click note and move. And now when I play it back, there you go. Then you can move these little points around. Yeah, it's pretty fun. Anyway, that's some of the insane stuff that you can do with sculpture. But the main thing is to remember that this is a string, and it's behaving, it's being excited by these different things, and how these objects and pickups and all these sort of things relate to each other is what's important about sculpture. And I have a whole bunch of other like really in-depth content in terms of how to program this thing, but I think you'll enjoy that. We could use your personal insight into alchemy, that's for sure. Wow, thought sculpture was intense? If we open up alchemy, this is one of the most powerful sound design tools ever made. It's really kind of amazing. I'm going to go to File and hit Clear, so we're really seeing this thing as, you know, as kind of stripped down as possible. What you have is up top, you have your sources, your filter, and your master. There are 4 different sources. Now, in each of these sources, you can either have virtual analog, which means it's just playing a wave back. You could also do granular synthesis. You could have an entire EXS-24 sampler instrument loaded up in here. It's pretty crazy. Another thing you can do that some people don't know about is you can actually just open your Apple Loop browser and drag a blue Apple Loop in. Like if I choose, I don't know, I still want something kind of cool. Go into my, where are my breaks? There we go. Just drag it in. And what it's going to do is it'll analyze this and everything will be in time with your song, which is pretty crazy. So I'm playing a key on Alchemy right now to play that back. Now listen when I play it low. So I can change pitch without changing time. So that's pretty crazy, and you can drag any piece of audio in there and it'll behave the same way. Alchemy is ridiculous. It's got granular synthesis, additive synthesis, spectral synthesis, virtual analog synthesis. You have FM built into the thing. You have 4 sources, and each source can have 3 filters. Then you have a global filter, which gives you 2 more filters. Then you have effects on the back end that you could put even more on. So you've got more filters than you could possibly imagine. In terms of modulation sources, you go here and you're like, oh, I only get 1 HDSR envelope? No, you can have up to 16. You can have 16 LFOs, 16 HDSR envelopes, 16 MSEG envelopes. You have 16 sequencers, all this stuff, all these modulation sources. It's just completely mind-bogglingly insane how much modulation you can do and how easy it is to assign. If I click on a source and I click on something like, I don't know, volume, modulation automatically is set up here to volume. Hit on, choose something like a sequencer, and when you hit play, now the sequencer is working on volume. And you can choose the intensity right over here. So yeah, it's basically, it's very simple how it's laid out, but the tools that you get within Alchemy are absolutely ridiculous. If I go into the spectral mode at the top here I am in the source, and here's my volume and pitch and all my filtering and all that kind of stuff. On the right, I get my spectral readout. I can start applying spectral effects. Check this out, like I like Bloom. So that's pretty fun. As you can see, it's smearing parts of the spectral image, which is really fun. Anyway, highly recommend playing around with the spectral effects. It's pretty cool. You have formant filters built into it. Under virtual analog, if I just go up here and do a saw wave, this stuff is pretty crazy. You have unison per source. So if I turn this up, I'm going to get 8 detuned copies of that same sound. So it basically turns into a dance song automatically. Alchemy is insanely deep. I do have some courses where I just go into everything, but it's insanely deep. So of course I can't cover it right now, and I can't do the whole thing because it's wild. But just those basic concepts. Here's global, 4 sources, filter master. Here are your individual sources. Here's where you can load in your audio, or you can get your individual waves if you like. To the right is the synthesis type. And then down below, when you click on a knob, your modulation pops up here, and you can assign your modulator, and the modulator will pop up on the right-hand side over here. When you get down here to performance effects, essentially what you can do is you can save 8 different versions of this patch and then be able to kind of move between them. And then you have these knobs that you can have assigned to anything you want. It's really fun. You have an arpeggiator, and you can either go to an arpeggiator per source, or you can do all, and then you have effects. All right. Alchemy, insanely deep, really fun. There's some basic concepts. Run with it. See what you can do.
Bye-bye, everybody. I'll make that other video sometime soon. Ciao.